Eternal Echoes presents A Yellow Flower, a work by Julio Cortázar. It seems like a joke, but we are immortal. I know it by negation. I know it because I have met the only mortal. He told me his story in a bistro on Rue Cambronne, so drunk that it cost him nothing to tell the truth, even as the owner and the old customers at the counter laughed until the wine spilled from their eyes. He must have seen some interest painted on my face because he straightened up, and we ended up indulging in the luxury of a table in a corner where we could drink and talk in peace. He told me he was a retired municipal worker and that his wife had gone back to her parents for a while, a way of admitting she had abandoned him. He was neither old nor ignorant, with a dry face and tubercular eyes. He was truly drinking to forget, and he proclaimed it after his fifth glass of wine. I didn't smell that scent that is the signature of Paris, but that apparently only foreigners perceive. His nails were well kept, and he had no dandruff. He recounted that on a bus on line 95, he had seen a boy of about 13, and after watching him for a while, he realized the boy resembled him a great deal. At least, he resembled the memory he had of himself at that age. Little by little, he admitted that the boy looked exactly like him. The face, the hands, the lock of hair falling over his forehead, the widely spaced eyes, and even more so, the shyness. The way he took refuge in a comic book, the gesture of pushing his hair back, the clumsy, awkward movements. The resemblance was so striking that he almost laughed, but when the boy got off at Rue de Rennes, he got off too, leaving a friend waiting for him in Montparnasse. He found an excuse to speak to the boy, asked him for directions, and heard, without surprise, a voice that was his own childhood voice. The boy was heading in that direction, so they timidly walked together for a few blocks. At that moment, a kind of revelation struck him. Nothing was explained, but it was something that required no explanation, something that became blurred or absurd when one tried, as he was now, to explain it. To summarize, he managed to find out where the boy lived, and with the prestige of having been a Boy Scout instructor, he made his way into that fortress of fortresses, a French home. He found a dignified poverty, an aged mother, a retired uncle, 2 cats. Later, it wasn't too difficult for one of his own brothers to entrust him with his 14-year-old son, and the 2 boys became friends. He started visiting Luke's home every week. The mother welcomed him with overcooked coffee, and they talked about the war, the occupation, and also about Luke. What had begun as a revelation was taking on a geometric shape, assuming that demonstrative profile that people like to call fate. It was even possible to put it into everyday words. Luke was himself. Once again, there was no mortality. We were all immortal. We're all immortal, old man. Look, no one had been able to prove it, and it had to be me. On a 95, a small error in the mechanism, a wrinkle in time, a simultaneous avatar instead of a consecutive one. Luke should have been born after my death, and yet, not to mention the fabulous coincidence of running into him on the bus. I think I already told you, it was a kind of absolute certainty, beyond words. That was it, and that was the end of it. But then the doubts began, because in these cases, you either consider yourself an idiot or you take tranquilizers. And along with the doubts, killing them one by one, came the proofs that I wasn't mistaken, that there was no reason to doubt. What I'm about to tell you is what makes those idiots laugh the most when I happen to tell them. Luke wasn't just me again. He was going to become like me, like this poor wretch speaking to you now. You only had to see him play. See how he always fell awkwardly, twisting an ankle or dislocating a collarbone. His emotions always on edge. That blush rising to his face whenever anyone asked him anything. The mother, on the other hand, how they love to talk, how they tell you everything even when the boy is there, dying of embarrassment, the most incredible intimacies, the anecdotes of his first tooth, his drawings at age 8, his childhood illnesses. The good woman suspected nothing, of course, and the uncle played chess with me. I was like part of the family. I even lent them money to make it to the end of the month. It took no effort at all to learn about Lucy's past, just slipping in questions between the topics that interested the old folks, the uncle's rheumatism, the porter's misdeeds, politics. That's how I got to know Luke's childhood, between checkmates and reflections on the price of meat. And that's how the proof unfolded, infallibly. But understand me, while we order another drink, Luke was me, what I had been as a child, but don't imagine it as an exact replica. More like an analogous figure, you see, meaning that at 7 years old I had dislocated a wrist and Luke a collarbone, and at 9 we had respectively had measles and scarlet fever, and besides, history intervened. Old man, when I had measles it lasted 15 days, whereas Luke was cured in 4 thanks to medical advances and so on. Everything was analogous, and that's why, to give you an example, it might well be that the baker on the corner is an avatar of Napoleon, and he doesn't know it because the order hasn't been altered, because he will never encounter the truth on a bus. But if somehow he were to realize this truth, he could understand that he has repeated and is repeating Napoleon, that moving from dishwasher to owning a successful bakery in Montparnasse is the same pattern as leaping from Corsica to the throne of France, and that if he carefully examined his life's history, he would find the moments corresponding to the Egyptian campaign, the consulate, and Austerlitz. And he might even realize that something is going to happen to his bakery in a few years, and that he will end up in a saint. Helena, that might be a tiny room on a 6th floor, but also defeated, also surrounded by the waters of solitude, also proud of his bakery, which was like an eagle's flight. You understand, don't you? I understood, but I argued that in childhood, we all have typical illnesses on schedule, and that almost all of us break something while playing football. I know, I have only told you about the visible coincidences. For example, the fact that Luke looked like me was of no importance, although it did play a role in the revelation on the bus. What was truly important were the sequences, and that is difficult to explain because they involve character, childhood fables. At that time, I mean when I was Luke's age, I had gone through a bitter period that started with an endless illness. Then, in the middle of my recovery, I went to play with my friends and broke an arm, and just as I was getting over that, I fell in love with a classmate's sister and suffered the way you suffer when you're incapable of looking into the eyes of a girl who is mocking you. Luke got sick too. Just as he was recovering, he was invited to the circus, and on his way down the stands, he slipped and dislocated his ankle. Shortly after, his mother found him one afternoon crying by the window, clutching a small blue handkerchief in his hand, a handkerchief that didn't belong to the house. Since someone has to play the role of the skeptic in life, I said that childhood crushes are the inevitable counterpart to bumps and pleurisy. But I admitted that the airplane incident was something else entirely, a wind-up propeller plane that he had brought for his birthday. When I gave it to him, I remembered once again the Meccano set my mother had given me when I was 14, and what had happened to me. What happened was that I was in the garden, even though a summer storm was approaching and thunder could already be heard, and I had started assembling a crane on the table in the gazebo near the front door. Someone called me from inside the house, and I had to go in for a minute. When I came back, the Meccano box had disappeared and the door was open. Desperate, I ran out onto the street yelling, but there was no one in sight, and at that very moment, a lightning bolt struck the house across the street. It all happened in a single act, and I was remembering it while handing the airplane to Luke, and he was looking at it with the same joy with which I had looked at my Meccano. His mother came to bring me a cup of coffee, and we were exchanging the usual small talk when we heard a scream. Luke had run to the window as if he wanted to throw himself out. His face was pale and his eyes were filled with tears. He managed to stammer that the airplane had veered in its flight, passing exactly through the gap of the half-open window. "I can't see it anymore. I can't see it anymore," he kept repeating, crying. We heard shouting from downstairs, and his uncle rushed in to announce that there was a fire in the house across the street. "Do you understand now?" "Yes, we'd better have another drink." Then, as I remained silent, the man said he had started thinking only about Luke's fate. His mother had planned for him to attend a vocational school so he could modestly carve out what she called his path in life, but that path was already laid out, and only he, who could not speak without being taken for a madman and permanently separated from Luke, could tell the mother and the uncle that it was all pointless, that no matter what they did, the result would be the same: humiliation, miserable routine, monotonous years, failures that eat away at both clothing and soul, retreating into bitter solitude in a neighborhood bistro. But the worst part was not Luke's fate. The worst part was that Luke would die in turn, and another man would repeat Luke's pattern and his own, only to die so that another man could step onto the wheel. Luke hardly mattered to him anymore. At night, his insomnia stretched beyond to another Luke, to others who would be named Robert or Claude or Michel, an infinite series of poor devils repeating the pattern unknowingly, convinced of their freedom and free will. The man had that sorrowful kind of drunkenness. There was nothing to be done about it. Now, they laugh at me when I tell them that Luke died a few months later. They're too stupid to understand that. Yes, don't look at me like that too. He died a few months later. It started as a kind of bronchitis, just as at that same age, I had suffered from a liver infection. I was hospitalized, but Luke's mother insisted on caring for him at home. I visited almost every day, and sometimes I brought my nephew to play with Luke. There was so much poverty in that house that my visits were a comfort in every sense. Companionship for Luke, a package of herring, or an apricot tart. They got used to me taking care of buying the medicine, especially after I told them about a pharmacy where I could get a special discount. They eventually accepted me as Luca's nurse, and you can imagine that in a house like that, where the doctor comes and goes without much interest, no one pays too much attention to whether the final symptoms completely match the initial diagnosis. Why are you looking at me like that? Did I say something I shouldn't have? No, he hadn't said anything inappropriate, especially at that stage of drinking. Quite the opposite, unless one imagines something horrible. The death of poor Luke only went to show that anyone given to imagination can begin fantasizing on bus 95 and end it beside the bed where a child is silently dying. To reassure him, I told him so. He stared at the air for a while before speaking again. Well, as you wish. The truth is, in those weeks after the funeral, I felt for the first time something that might have resembled happiness. I still visited Luke's mother from time to time, brought her a package of biscuits, but I hardly cared about her or the house anymore. I was almost flooded with the marvelous certainty of being the first true mortal, of feeling my life wear away day after day, wine after wine, and that in the end, it would finish anywhere, at any hour, repeating to the very last the fate of some unknown man who had died who knows where and when. But I would be truly dead, with no Luke stepping into the wheel to stupidly repeat a stupid life. Understand that fullness, old man. Envy me such happiness while it lasted, because apparently it hadn't lasted. The bistro and the cheap wine proved it, as did those eyes where a fever burned that wasn't of the body. And yet, for a few months, He had lived savoring every moment of his everyday mediocrity, his marital failure, his ruin at 50, certain of his inalienable mortality. One afternoon, crossing through Luxembourg, he saw a flower. It was at the edge of a flower bed, just some ordinary yellow flower. I had stopped to light a cigarette and got distracted looking at it. It was almost as if the flower were looking at me too. Those moments of connection sometimes. You know, anyone can feel them, that thing they call beauty. That was exactly it. The flower was beautiful. It was a lovely flower, and I was condemned. I was going to die one day, forever. The flower was beautiful. There would always be flowers for the men of the future. Suddenly, I understood nothingness, that which I had mistaken for peace, the end of the chain. I was going to die, and Luke was already dead. There would never again be a flower for someone like us. There would be nothing, absolutely nothing. And nothingness was exactly that there would never again be a flower. The burning match seared my fingers. In the square, I jumped onto a bus going anywhere and absurdly started looking at everything visible in the street, everything inside the bus. When we reached the final stop, I got off and boarded another bus heading toward the suburbs. All afternoon, into the evening, I rode and switched buses, thinking of the flower and of Luke, searching among the passengers for someone who looked like Luke, someone who looked like me or like Luke, someone who could be me again, someone to look at, knowing it was me, and then letting him go without saying anything, almost protecting him so he could continue his poor, stupid life, his foolish, failed life, leading into another foolish, failed life, into another foolish, failed life, into another. I paid. The end. Thanks for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like, subscribe so you don't miss any videos, and let me know in the comments which work you'd like me to bring to the channel. See you in the next video.